In this video, I'm going to talk about the 7 biggest mistakes you can make as a beginner miniature painter, and perhaps more importantly than that, I'm going to talk about how we fix them. Now, one of these is going to be a little bit controversial, and one is something I don't think we talk about enough, so it's really important we get it out there. So whether you're new or old, stick around. I hope you learn something new. Let's get into it. The first mistake we make is getting overwhelmed and not actually putting any paint on a miniature. So you've just found this fantastic new hobby called miniature painting. You may have wandered into a games workshop or got involved in a Dungeons and Dragons game, and you've seen some really, and I mean really cool miniatures, and you want to get painting them. So you get set up with some brushes and some paints, and then you head home ready to start. You jump on YouTube, you watch some tutorials, and before you know it, you're down a complete rabbit hole, and there's just so much information out there that you don't really know where to start. You don't want to mess up your precious new miniatures you've just bought, so what do we do? How do we get rid of that confusion? Well, the good news is, it's really easy to do this, and all you need to do is start. That's all you have to do is start, regardless of where you are, regardless of what you've watched. Open a pot of paint, put your brush in it, and start painting that miniature. Feel the fear, and do it anyway. This applies here. Nothing's unfixable. If it goes completely wrong, we'll be able to strip it later. But better still, if you've got some spare parts, start painting on those. The important thing is that we start. So you've built up the courage to start painting your miniatures, and that brings us to our second mistake, which is messing up the priming. Now, you might have heard of priming, and essentially all it is putting a layer of paint down that helps all the other paint that comes after it stick to the model. So how can we mess this up? Well, you can not put any on at all, and you can just paint on bare plastic or resin or metal, or you can put on too much, which will then lead to having all the detail obscured and a gloopy mess. Either way, sad face. So how do we do it right? Well, introducing how to primerize. Trademark. Okay, that's not a real word, but hopefully this advice can help. Generally, when we're priming, we tend to use a can, maybe Chaos Black from Citadel, Army Painter, even some Rust-Oleum car primer, whatever your poison of choice is. Firstly, make sure that you've given your can a really good shake for at least 2 minutes to make sure everything is well mixed and that mixing ball gives it a chance to get to work. Next, go to a well ventilated area and spray rapidly back and forth across your minis, starting and ending off the miniature. So I spray into a box and contain any overspray. You don't have to, as long as there's nobody around. Make sure there's no washing on the line. And you can really see the difference by doing it this way and getting a nice thin coat. One tip I'll give you using some lighter primers is that they don't always cover first go. You'll have to put several layers on, so make sure you're patient when it comes to this. Put your first layer down, let it dry, and then put your second, third and fourth to get a really nice even coverage on there. If you put one thick layer on, it's going to obscure detail, it might spiderweb, it's not going to be pleasant, and it will wreck the model. Once we've got that primer down, you may have heard the saying, use 2 thin coats. You may even have heard it on my channel, but I'm here to tell you to forget about it. Now that's controversial, I know, but hear me out. So every paint from every manufacturer has different properties. You may even sometimes get differences in the same colour from the same manufacturer. I know I have with Mephiston Red, for example, in the past. And when we talk about 2 thin coats, we're talking about using 2 layers of paint to create a solid opaque layer. The reason I say forget about this is when you're just getting started, take the opportunity to learn about how different paint works and how to thin it in general. Now, I've got a full video that goes into this detail, which I'll link at the end of this video, but depending on what you're painting, you may be able to use it straight from the pot. Shocked face. In particular, if you're base coating and only have a small amount of paint on your brush, you can really spread the paint out on the mini to get great coverage right out of the pot without losing any detail, just like in the example you've seen on the screen. The key here is the amount of paint on your brush, which can also lead us into mistake number 4. Mistake number 4 is having too much paint on your brush. Now, if some paint is good, more must be better, right? Well, no, not exactly. Firstly, let's talk about your brush. So we have the tip, the belly and the ferrule. Now, we want to keep paint out of the ferrule, as if it gets in there, it can dry and start to degrade the glue that holds all the bristles together, causing your brush to fray and become unusable. We also want a decent sized belly on the brush to hold all of the paint and a good tip to help us paint details. Now, I've got a full video on what brush to use and I'll link that in the description. So let's look at what happens if you have too much paint on your brush. When you put it on the miniature, it's really hard to control and can clog up some detail, as well as go over sections you've already finished, which can be frustrating as well as time consuming. We also lose that nice tip on the brush. So how do we get around this? Easy. First off, we need to draw the brush through the paint, twisting as we go to keep that point. Next, we want to touch the brush on a paper towel to get rid of any excess before we go to the model. Nice and easy. This will also help with the next mistake. Mistake number 5 is thinning your paint too much. You'll end up taking forever to cover your model, and no one wants that. If you combine this mistake with mistake number 4, then you can end up with a real soupy mess, and this isn't great on a number of fronts. Not least because it can lead to being disheartened and you putting down your brushes for a while. There's absolutely a time and a place to have thin paint when you're layering and feathering as well as glazing, but we're not talking about those techniques in this video. So how do we make sure our paint is just right? Let's have a look at the palette. I've added some paint straight from the pot. Now I'll add some water. I usually dip my paint into the water and mix it all up, so it's around about a 1-to-1 mix, and this is the result. Let's wipe it on a paper towel and paint some layers on this mini. Perfect. This is where we can start to think about 2 thin coats, or start to get into some other techniques. The one caveat here is that there are many factors that can influence how you thin your paint. It could be the pigment density, the brand, the colour, the age of the paint also comes into it. So just take time to learn how your paint works for you. And if you're in doubt, check that video I'm going to link right at the end, which shows you how I do it. The next mistake I want to talk about is probably the overbearing lesson in my life, and that is patient. When it comes to most things in life, patience is a virtue, and that's no different when it comes to miniature painting. We need to let paint dry, we need to let glue dry, we need to let decals dry. We need to take our time. All skills that are sometimes easier said than done, especially if we need to get something done by a deadline. Now we can speed some things up with a hairdryer, being careful not to melt anything, but I want to talk to you about why we need this. If we rush, we make mistakes. If we rush, then our paint's too much, have too much paint on our brush, we can cause issues such as tears in the paint, which can really affect the finish on the model. I can be a nightmare for this, especially with contrast paint. I need to practice patience. So how do we get around this little obstacle? Well, for me, it's about remembering why we paint in the first place. I started as a way of relaxing, and for me it's a real form of expression and creativity. I really love to sit down and paint and produce something at the end of it. So why did you start painting? Let me know in the comments. Was it for relaxation? Was it because you loved to game? Let me know. The other thing I like to do is have something else to paint in between everything I have going on. So if I've got to wait for stuff to dry, I can pick something else up and just potter away on it in the background. I might do some work on a higher end project, or I might do something totally different to what I'm working on at the moment. It really does help to break things up. The next mistake we make is expecting our models to look like they do on the box and then getting disappointed and disheartened when they don't. Now this is perhaps something we don't talk about or doesn't get discussed very often, because we always see fantastic work, whether it's by expert painters, whether it's on the box art of models, but ultimately the box art is there to sell you the model. Now all of my tutorials are geared to try and get you something that looks like the box art without having to have all the skill, the ingenuity, the time and the practice that goes into being able to paint at that level. And the thing that's really important here is to remember that any painting journey is a little bit like climbing a mountain. Nobody lands on the summit of a mountain. Everyone has to make that trek, and some parts are really easy and some parts are really difficult, and whichever part that is going to be different for everyone. The important point is that if you persevere and you practice deliberately, you will get there eventually. In this kind of situation, it's really important to manage your expectations, and of course it doesn't hurt to watch all of my videos all the way through. I mean, that helps me, it helps you, everybody wins. Focus on getting the basics right, and that will set you on a path to improve faster. And don't give yourself too much of a hard time. This is meant to be fun and enjoyable, so make it that way. Always remember there are a plethora of ways to paint, as well as any number of different products, some good, some awful, and you need to focus on what you can control, which is the time, effort and deliberate practice you put in. If you're happy with just base coating and adding some shading to a model, that is absolutely fine. So there we go, that's my list of what I think are the 7 biggest mistakes beginner miniature painters can make. Did I miss anything out? Let me know in the comments. Check out that video I promised you on how to thin your paints, and if you really like what I do, check out my Patreon link in the description. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.